From time to time in a DUI case, you have to go head to head, toe to toe with a government expert witness. Oftentimes in a DUI, we're talking about a forensic chemist. The chemist could be interpreting a breath test, interpreting a blood test, doing retrograde extrapolation. Just as a reminder, retrograde extrapolation is the procedure that the government uses, or sometimes we use, to translate the data point, the breath test at the time of testing, back to what the number would be at the time of driving. Of course, if you're using a rising alcohol defense, you want to be able to extrapolate back, showing that your driver's breath alcohol or blood alcohol level was lower when he or she was driving than when they're tested, which around here is typically an hour to an hour and a half later. Anyway, sometimes your client can't bring in a forensic chemist as a defense expert, and you have to be the expert. That's one reason why we strongly encourage everybody to attend as many seminars as you can and learn as much as you can so you can be the expert. For many years, the local prosecutors employed the services of a local forensic chemist who actually worked at our crime lab. And in the early days, before I learned what I was doing, he was a real pebble in my shoe. In later years, I became more of a thorn in his flesh. Whenever he would come to testify at a trial of mine, I would bring props. This is one of my favorite props. You can see that his name was Robert Parsons, and I have a rather thick binder that I would bring to court and just set on counsel table so that the jury could read it. Jury could read the cover. It's full of transcripts. It's full of articles that I may or may not use to cross-examine him. And frankly, there's filler in there. I'm pretty sure there's one or two Sports Illustrated articles in there. There's some shopping lists and other things. But it always served to annoy the prosecutor and Mr. Parsons, which was exactly what I wanted to do. If you know me, you'll know that I think that part of doing trial work well is entertaining the jury. If you know me well, you know that I like entertaining myself as well. So I like to use props in trial. One of my favorite props to use when I'm cross-examining the forensic chemist is a copy of Garriott's. I hope all of you have Garriott's. Garriott's is the medical legal aspects of alcohol. And the first edition of Garriott's that I got was the green covered 4th edition, edited by the now late great James Garriott. There are many peer-reviewed scientific journal articles that are contained within this volume. One of them that I particularly enjoy using was written by Kurt Dubowski. Another was written by our friend A.W. Jones. And time again, I've used this volume in court to cross-examine the forensic chemist, my friend, Mr. Parsons. So somewhere along the line, I was attending a blood testing seminar in San Diego. Bubba Head had put together a collection of scientists, including Dr. Jones, and I went out to learn about blood testing, and everyone who attended was given a copy of hot off the presses, the 5th edition of Garriott's. And the cover here is a very dark blue, almost black. And I was sitting in class trying to learn blood testing science, but thinking, of course, of my next trial. And the idea popped into my head that I control my budget for continuing education, including what do I buy for my library. The forensic chemist that works at the government crime lab doesn't have that luxury. He gets the books or the budget for books that they give him. And it occurred to me that he probably doesn't have the brand new edition of Garriott's. And he probably doesn't even know there is a brand new edition of Garriott's, because the crime lab is part of a local community college. And I'm just guessing that here in the hinterlands, they don't have that kind of budget. So I started thinking about, how can I have some fun with this? So I get back home and I scheduled Mr. Parsons' deposition. I had the germ of an idea. And I took with me to the deposition a copy of the green 4th edition, Medical Legal Aspects of Alcohol. And I asked him about it. And, he and I had this conversation in court before, so I knew what his answers were going to be, even in deposition, but I played it low key. And I asked him if he was familiar with this. And of course, he said yes. And I asked him if he recognized James Garriott as a legitimate scientific expert. He said yes. And I opened it to the article that I like, written by Dubowski. And I asked him if Kurt Dubowski was, in his opinion, a recognized expert in the field. And I asked him the same thing about A.W. Jones. And I said, now I hear that people in your line of work sometimes refer to Garriott's as the Bible. And the chemist starts to smirk a little bit. And I said, I can tell by your expression that you've heard that too, right? And he said, yes. And I said, you've heard a number of people refer to this book, Garriott's, as the Bible. He said, yes. And I said, even people that work here in the crime lab refer to it as the Bible. He said, yes. You've heard them refer to it as the Bible. And he said, yes. And of course, I'm building this transcript. I'm going to use the transcript of this deposition in court if he turns into a weasel. But I continue this line of questioning, and I say, in fact, you've even referred to this as the Bible, haven't you? And he said, yes. And I said, you probably have a copy of this in your office. And he said, yes. And I asked him questions about a couple of other books that he might have in his office library. And I asked him if it would be okay after the deposition if he took me back and I could take a look at what he's got in his library. And he agreed to that. This whole deposition was a setup for a trial in a different case. When the different case came to court, I had fun using what I like to now refer to as the Bible cross. Mr. Parsons testified on direct, and I got up for my turn and I reached into my trial briefcase, more like a suitcase, and I took out the now very familiar green covered 4th edition Garriott's Medical Legal Aspects of Alcohol. And Mr. Parsons sat back in his chair, crossed his arms because he was relaxed, comfortable with what he knew was coming, or he thought was coming. And I started to ask him questions to set up the cross about using Dubowski's quotes from his articles and Jones' quotes from his articles, things I had used before. And it was basically, in the past, it had been a slugfest, Ali versus Frazier, with both of us scoring points. Creed versus Rocky for you younger folks. So I asked him the basic foundation questions. Does he recognize this book? Does he consider it to be a learned treatise? Because I was using a Terry McCarthy style cross, I was actually the only one testifying, and he was just going, yes, 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 agreeing with me. And of course, part of what I was doing was setting up my trap, but another part was I was building credibility with the jury, because they're seeing this guy who they thought was a scientific expert agreeing with everything I said. So I asked him, do you recognize Dr. Garriott as an expert? Yes. Do you recognize Dr. Jones as an expert? Yes. Do you recognize Dubowski as an expert? And I flipped to the article I use, and I said, you're familiar with Dubowski's article? And I read the name of it. And you're familiar with Jones' article, and I read the name of it. And so he was all ready for the cross I've used on him time and time again. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But I decided now I get to have some fun. So I walked back over to my table and I said, I'm going to get to those articles in a minute. And I reached into my briefcase and I pulled out, much to his horror, the dark blue covered 5th edition of Garriott's Medical Legal Aspects of Alcohol. And it was clear from his expression that he didn't know there was a 5th edition. He'd never seen it before. And as I'm walking up, I said, the new 5th edition is out, not even as a question. And he just nodded. And I said, it's still edited by Gary. He's still, in your opinion, he's still an expert, isn't he? Yes. And I opened to the table of contents, and I've got a bunch of tabs, if you can see. I've tabbed a bunch of things that I intend to use, and I've tabbed a couple of things just so there'll be more tabs. But I look at the list of contributors on the opening page, and I start going down the list, and I see Dubowski on there. Dubowski's still an expert, isn't he? Dubowski was alive at the time. Goldberger's an expert, isn't he? Dr. Jones is an expert, isn't he? Because they had contributed chapters to this new book. Now, this poor chemist had no idea what those articles said. But now he's sweating and he's wondering, what exactly am I going to ask him? And I decided to start with something really easy. Instead of going to the specifics, I just said, with the green one in one hand and the blue one in the other, I said, Mr. Parsons, would it be okay if during the rest of this trial, you and I refer to the green book as the Old Testament and the blue one as the New Testament? Well, everybody in the courtroom laughed, including the judge, who, by the way, from time to time still refers to me as the rabbi, including everybody on the jury. Even the prosecutor laughed, everybody except Mr. Parsons. So this is an example of the Bible cross, and you don't even have to have read anything in either book to be able to pull this off. And it's just one more way where you can have fun with their expert.